So wonderful to have this opportunity to have so many people join us from all over. This is our Happy Birthday Hamilton event, and this talk will be exploring some of Hamilton's early pro-revolutionary pamphlets, the original publication of which occurred about 250 years ago. And of course, the Farmers Refuted a few years ago might have only been known by a few very intensive scholars of the Revolutionary War or of Alexander Hamilton. But of course, today, many more people are aware of the Farmer Refuted thanks to anyone that's listened to the Hamilton musical soundtrack. And that's actually one of my favorite songs of how it blends so seamlessly a dense political argument between two sides leading up to the opposing viewpoints going into the Revolutionary War. So, for those that might already be introduced to these pamphlets, I'm very excited that we will have the opportunity to dive in a little bit more in depth about the actual pamphlets that were published. So these pamphlets were published in 1774 into 1775, and this explores the war of words between Reverend Samuel Seabury, writing under the pseudonym of A.W. Farmer, a Westchester farmer, and the young Alexander Hamilton, a recent immigrant who quickly adopted the patriots' cause. In response to Seabury's three pamphlets attacking Congress, Hamilton responded forcefully with a full vindication of the measures of Congress and The Farmer Refuted, writing under the pseudonym of Friend to America. As the speakers today will discuss, these pamphlets provide vivid examples of the tense political climate in the months before the eruption of hostilities. Moreover, even in these early writings, Hamilton reveals a profound understanding of the concepts of freedom and justice, as well as a vision for what America could and should become. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Mariana Aller, Chair of the AHA Society and Associate Curator of Special Collections at Wellesley College, together with Dr. Thomas Aller, the Vice Chair of the AHA Society and a Master Lecturer in Writing in Boston University. With that, let us welcome Tom and Mariana Aller. Thank you.
Hey, well, thanks for that introduction, Nicole, and thanks everyone for coming. Good afternoon and welcome. It's good to see you all. So what we'd like to do is start out by reminding you of some of the historical context that led up to the pamphlets. So after the French and Indian War, the British government imposed a variety of acts on the American colonists. So we have the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, and the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. And we're going to focus on the last two of these, the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts. So in the image on the left, you see a representation of the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, with the Americans throwing cargoes of tea into the harbor. And it was this action in response to the Tea Act that led directly to the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. So if you take a look at the image on the right, this is a print, interestingly, published in the London magazine, and it's satirizing the Intolerable Acts. So we have the colony of Massachusetts Bay represented by a Native American woman who's being held down. And these are specific individuals who were involved in this. We have Lord Justice Mansfield holding her by the arms. We have Lord North pouring tea down her throat, and the American colonies are vomiting it back out. We have the Earl of Sandwich holding her by the legs. And off to the left, we have France and Spain looking on. In the background, Boston cannonaded. In the right, we have Britannia with her hand over her face because she can't bear to look and see what's happening. And on the far right, we have a representation of martial law. So even in England, people were very aware that these acts that were imposed on Boston were a violation of the rights of the colonies. So, yeah, so the Intolerable Acts led immediately or very quickly to a response on the part of the colonists. So within Massachusetts, a group of citizens gathered together and passed some resolves known as the Suffolk Resolves. So their demands were that we boycott British imports and curtail exports and refuse to use British products. And we would pay no obedience to the Massachusetts Government Act or the Boston Port Act. So the Government Act said that all government employees have to be appointed by representatives of the Crown rather than by the people. And the Port Act shut down the harbor. So in the resolves, they demanded that those appointed to these positions resign, and we refuse to pay taxes until the Government Act is overturned, and support a colonial government free of royal authority until all of the Intolerable Acts are repealed. And not only that, but urge all the colonies to raise a militia of their own people. So this leads to the first Continental Congress. So actually, this is has already been convened. So when people in the different colonies saw what was happening in Massachusetts, they were very disturbed, and a Congress was convened, and there were delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, and they met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, which you can see here, starting on September 5th of 1774. And the first thing that they did was they adopted the Suffolk Resolves, and they drafted their own declaration and resolves, which included something called the Continental Association. So the Continental Association imposed a ban starting on December 1, 1774, on importing or consuming any goods from any of the British territories, Britain itself, Ireland, and the West Indies. They also planned to impose an export ban on any products from the American colonies to Britain, Ireland, or the West Indies if the Intolerable Acts were not repealed by September 10 of the next year. And then it set up procedures for implementing these policies. First of all, it banned price gouging. It recommended that local communities of inspection be set up in each colony to ensure compliance with the rules. And those who violated the pledges in the articles would be called out in the press as, quote, enemies of American liberty. So now we're going to take a look at the protagonists in this pamphlet war. So first, I'm going to be representing Samuel Seabury. Mariana is going to be representing Alexander Hamilton. So God save the king. And by the way, at this time, both Hamilton and Seabury would say that we owe loyalty to the king, and you'll see that as we discuss these pamphlets. So Seabury was born in Connecticut. He was the son of a minister. He went to Yale and then studied theology and studied medicine. He was ordained a minister and served in various positions. And the one that's most important for us is St. Peter's Church in Westchester, which is now the Westchester Square neighborhood in the Bronx, in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. So,
oh, well, I'll take over for Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was born on Nevis in the Caribbean about 1754. He was abandoned by his father and soon orphaned. His mother passed away in 1768, and he was left penniless at a young age. He began working in his early teens for a mercantile firm of Beekman and Kruger on St. Croix, showing rare gifts as a clerk and financial manager. And he came to America in 1772 and entered King's College, now Columbia University, in 1773, and soon began agitating for the patriot cause. Now we're going to introduce the pamphlets. Seabury wrote 4 pamphlets that he published. And the first one, Free Thoughts on the Proceedings of Congress, came weeks after Congress's work was done. On November 16th, it was published. And within a few days after, he followed by writing another pamphlet. We call it Seabury 2, The Congress Canvassed. That pamphlet, however, was not published until Hamilton had published his reply to Seabury's one. And Hamilton's reply comes out in the middle of December, published on December 15 by Rivington Press. And it's called A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress. And these titles are brief. If we read the whole title, it will look much different. Seabury followed with his own reply to Hamilton's A Full Vindication. It's called The View of the Controversy, and that came just a few days after Hamilton published A Full Vindication on December 24th. And those are not short pamphlets. Seabury wrote one more pamphlet before he concluded his pamphlet writing on the topic. It was called An Alarm to the New York Legislature, published in the middle of January. And Hamilton's biggest and most forceful, powerful pamphlet came out towards the end of February. On February 23, it was called The Farmer Refuted.
Okay, so, as Mariana said, those were abbreviated titles. So here's the full title from the title page. Free Thoughts on the Proceedings of the Continental Congress held at Philadelphia, September 5, 1774, wherein their errors are exhibited, their reasonings confuted, and the fatal tendency of their non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption measures are laid open to the plainest understandings, and the only means pointed out for preserving and securing our present happy constitution. In a letter to the farmers and other inhabitants of North America in general, and of those of the province of New York in particular, by a farmer. So Seabury uses the pseudonym a farmer, or A.W. Farmer, a Westchester Farmer, as Nicole had said. And he ends, "Hear me, for I will speak." And the whole series of pamphlets, both Seabury and Hamilton, were published by James Rivington. And down at the bottom of the page, you can see the source. So if you want to find Hamilton's pamphlets, you just go to Founders Online. But if you want to find Seabury, you can go to Project Canterbury and Letters of a Westchester Farmer, and then you'll find the entire text. So what does Seabury say in this first pamphlet, Free Thoughts on the Proceedings of Congress? So first of all, again, he adopts the persona of a simple farmer from Westchester in New York, and he talks to fellow farmers. He says that the rash measures of the Continental Congress, non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation, will hurt the good people of Great Britain and Ireland and the West Indies, but they're going to hurt us more. And by the way, Britain can put down any rebellion. They can block our trade. They can impose sanctions, while our current trading partners can easily find other markets. Seabury claims that the civil courts will be closed and only the criminal courts will remain open. So what will this mean? A hungry man who steals bread will be hanged, while a dishonest man who shirks his debts will remain free. And he concludes, previous boycotts have failed, and this one will too. So according to Seabury, the non-consumption agreement and the committees set up to enforce it amount to the most abject slavery. He writes, quote, "Think me not too severe, anarchy and confusion, violence and oppression, distress to my country. And I must and will speak, though the open violator of the laws may escape punishment through the pusillanimity of the magistrates, he will feel the lash of my pen, and he shall feel it again and again till remorse shall sting his guilty conscience and shame cover his opprobrious head." So here he sounds pretty much like a preacher, which he is. Okay, so now Seabury argues, we, the farmers, should reject Congress and the committees and petition the New York General Assembly for redress of grievances. And he hints at a threat. If we don't, God knows where our distresses may terminate. And he argues that the measures of Congress were not unanimous. In fact, he says not 1 in 100 New Yorkers voted for the delegates to Congress, and dissents, of which there were many among the New York delegates, were not mentioned in the minutes. So now we're going to take a look at Seabury's second essay, The Congress Canvass. So again, this was written, it was completed by the end of November, but it wasn't published until somewhere between December 16 and 22nd. And this was like the earliest possible date when it was published was the day after Hamilton published Full Vindication. And we know this because Seabury included a postscript that said he had read at the last minute Hamilton's Full Vindication, but it didn't have time to reply to it yet. So in contrast to the previous essay, which was directed to the farmers, this one is directed to the merchants of New York. So he's here expanding his criticism of Congress. He's criticizing the measures of Congress and also the way in which they were chosen. And he's really outraged by the conduct of the citizens of Boston and of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He asks the merchants why they submit to the dictates of Congress. He also reminds the colonists that the right thing to do, they should exhaust all legal measures before turning to violence and rebelling. And he warns of the horrific risks of the current ascent, the potential secession of Massachusetts and the rest of New England, followed by attacks against New York and bloody civil war. So as soon as New England secedes, they're going to try to claim territory from New York, so be careful. He says, besides, are you sure that while you are supporting the authority of the Congress and exalting it over your own legislature, that you are not nourishing and bringing to maturity a grand American republic, which shall, after a while, rise to power and grandeur upon the ruins of our present English Constitution? To me, the danger appears more than possible. The outlines of it seem already to be drawn. So nothing could be worse than this, breaking away from the mother country and forming our own republic. And Seabury rejects the idea that the colonies can remain loyal to the king while refusing to adhere to laws passed by Parliament. And this is something that's interesting because, again, throughout this pamphlet war, both Hamilton and Seabury are entirely loyal to the king. And then the question is, what powers should Parliament have? Whereas in the Declaration of Independence, things have already progressed to the point where Jefferson and the delegates at the Second Continental Congress can't believe that the king is not to blame. So if you look at the set of grievances in the Declaration of Independence, they are directed specifically at King George III. So he's the one. So that allows us to make the break. We've already said we're not subordinate to Parliament, and now we're no longer subordinate to the king. But that's a couple of years later. So again, in this postscript, Seabury notes that he has read Full Vindication, didn't have time to reply to it, but he doesn't see anything in it that would cause him to revise his first two pamphlets.
And now we're going to move on to Hamilton's reply, A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress, which comes out on December 15th. Hamilton praises the measures of Congress as fair and just, and he argues that the absolute sovereignty of Parliament will result in our absolute slavery. The dispute is not about the 3 pence per pound duty on East India tea, as Seabury claims. It is about freedom, which is a natural right. We must either submit to restrictions on our trade, or we must resist vi et armis, that is, by force and arms. He concludes that Britain has acted unjustly, even criminally, towards us. Our cause is just, but is it good policy? Hamilton lays out 3 criteria for a good policy. First, do the times require it? Second, will it do more good than harm? Third, is it likely to succeed? Hamilton says yes on points 1 and 2. Britain is trying to reduce us to slavery, and non-importation and non-consumption are inconvenient, but not life-threatening. And he also says yes on point 3, because Britain would suffer it if trade is cut off and would likely have to redress our grievances. Indeed, Britain would have to either restore our rights or wage war against us, or cut off trade completely. Even if Britain cuts off trade, America is rich in natural resources and can develop manufactures, Hamilton argues. Britain would suffer much more than America due to its internal conditions. We believe that citizens in the rest of the empire will not resent us, and we invite other colonies to join us. Cutting off trade would hurt the British economy. It would be too expensive to block American ports and would cause resentment in America. We are not trying to threaten Britain, but, as he quotes, we are not such asses as to let them ride us as they please, end quote. Next, Hamilton directly addresses the farmers of New York. He doesn't claim to be a farmer like Seabury did, but speaks the truth. You would rather die than be slaves or let Parliament take your property in taxes. Why is all of Boston being punished for the actions of a few? It is even worse in Canada.
Yeah, so in Boston, the city was occupied by the British Army and the harbor was blockaded by the British Navy. And Hamilton says it's even worse in Canada because in what's now Quebec, what happened was the English Constitution was suspended and French laws were imposed. And also Catholicism was imposed or established as the established religion in place of the Anglican religion. So for the American colonists, who were mostly Protestant, this was something that was seemed really dangerous.
So Hamilton argues the measures of Congress won't ruin farmers. They were passed unanimously in Congress. Honest men have nothing to fear from the committees. Hamilton has final advice for the farmers of New York that I'm going to quote. Now, the first part of this quote is actually the words of Seabury. The farmer cries, "Tell me not of delegates, congresses, committees, mobs, riots, insurrections, associations, a plague on them all. Give me the steady, uniform, unbiased influence of the courts of justice. I have been happy under their protection, and I trust in God I shall be so again." And Hamilton proclaims, "I say, tell me not of the British Commons, Lords, ministry, ministerial tools, placemen, pensioners, parasites. I scorn to let my life and property depend upon the pleasure of any of them. Give me the steady, uniform, unshaken security of constitutional freedom. Give me the right to be tried by a jury of my own neighbors and to be taxed by my own representatives only. What will become of the law and courts of justice without this? The shadow may remain, but the substance will be gone. I would die to preserve the law upon a solid foundation. But take away liberty, and the foundation is destroyed." End quote.
Okay, so now we're going to move to Seabury 3, a view of the controversy. So the first thing you have to know is that Seabury was really irritated by Hamilton's full vindication. And I think as a well-respected minister, he wasn't used to being contradicted. And in this case, he had previously addressed the farmers of New York and then the merchants. Now he's addressing the person that he calls, quote, the vindicator, directly. So Seabury defends his first two pamphlets, and he really harshly criticizes Hamilton's views, especially the lack of restraints and checks on Congress. And he has his own view of humans as they were in the state of nature before the rise of society and civilization. And he believes that back in the old days, it was a state of violence. So we need laws to control men. So Seabury, yes, he praises freedom, but he also asserts that colonies must be subject to the supreme authority of the mother country's government, and that means the king, the lords, and the commons. So this is the king and parliament. And he says, to talk of being liege subjects to King George, while we disavow the authority of parliament, is another piece of Whiggish nonsense. If we obey the laws of the king, we obey the laws of the parliament. If we disown the authority of the parliament, we disown the authority of the king. So in order to prove his point, as he believes, he cites various colonial charters to support the claim that we should submit to the laws of the British Parliament, including taxation. So since Britain protects us, we must obey its laws. We must pay our taxes. Yes, provincial assemblies have the right to exist, but they must not supersede Parliament. If we, colonists, believe that the British laws are unjust, then we should turn to the provincial assemblies, the loyalist assemblies. They're the ones who will petition the British government for us. So the British right of making laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever does not mean slavery, according to Seabury. It merely asserts the supreme authority of Great Britain over all her dominions. And Seabury accuses Congress of malicious intent, and he says there have been previous petitions that succeeded. So most of the previous acts, tax acts, and so on that were imposed were actually overturned. The current measures of Congress will seriously harm America. And then he makes this analogy: if a man puts a pistol to his breast and draws the trigger, the pistol will fire just as vigorously if he turned the muzzle the other way, but the consequence will be very different. So in other words, the colonies are harming themselves much more with these measures than they're harming the people of Great Britain. Not only that, he accuses Americans of trying to weasel out of their debts. So one reason for all these protests is because they don't want to pay the money they already owe. Seabury believes that Britain will use force if America allows it no other option, and America doesn't have the military strength and resources to succeed. There's going to be a civil war, and if there is, it will be horrific and bloody. So then he ends in a kind of curious way. First, he accuses Hamilton of lying, and then he makes a joke about taxes. So Hamilton had said, well, you know, the British are going to ultimately tax everything, including if a farmer's daughter kisses. Okay, so this is how Seabury responds. He says, I have a good mind to take Hamilton up on the idea of a kissing tax. No reflection, sir, upon farmer's daughter. They love kissing, 'tis true, and so did your mother, or you would scarce have made your appearance among us. He says that he will propose this kissing tax to Lord North, and that it will soon pay off Britain's debt. So then he gets serious for his ultimate conclusion, and he's talking about rumors of secret proceedings in Congress. So Congress is going to try to set up some kind of Eastern Republic and a Western Republic, and Seabury demands, let the gentlemen of Congress tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so we can get to the bottom of all these cabals that are going on. And then there's one more pamphlet that Seabury writes in this series, and it's called An Alarm to the New York Legislature. So this is directed to the New York General Assembly, and these are loyalists. So he details his complaints about Congress, and it's pretty similar to what he had said before. He asks Congress, he begs them to deliver the colony from this intolerable state of slavery imposed by Congress before it ends in rebellion. And he warns that rebels have already taken control of colonial militias, and nothing is worse than military dictatorship. He argues that the people of New York should not follow the ruinous example of the other colonies, and he advises the Assembly to petition the King and the Parliament for a constitution for America. So we need more regulation in order to keep these rebels under control.
And now we're going to go to the Farmer Refuted, by far the longest essay and most powerful of the whole set. That was printed in February of 75. In it, Hamilton addresses Seabury directly, arguing that he has only enough ability to earn the praise of fools. He focuses on replying to a view of the controversy, Seabury's third pamphlet, but also responds to the Congress canvassed. And he rejects Seabury's grim views of humans in the state of nature, which he calls Hobbesian. Building on the ideas of William Blackstone, the great English legal scholar, Hamilton argues that, quote, in a state of nature, no man had any moral power to deprive another of his life, limbs, property, or liberty, end quote. And another quote, the origin of all civil government must be a voluntary compact between the rulers and the ruled, end quote. According to Hamilton, Parliament is obviously not adhering to these principles. America can disobey laws passed by Parliament and still be loyal to the king. If the king protects us, we must obey him, but we don't need to submit to Parliament. Representative government generally works well in the mother country, but it becomes corrupt when applied to the colonies. Members of Parliament gain popularity at home by relieving the burdens of their local constituents and imposing taxes on the colonists. Britain is jealous of our, in quotes, dawning splendor and fears that this might lead to independence. Hamilton agrees with philosopher David Hume that all men are knaves who serve only their own self-interest. But this self-interest must be harnessed. Because there are no checks on Parliament, they have no right to govern us. In order to prove this claim, Hamilton gives a detailed history lesson on the colonial charters. Seabury doubted that Hamilton has read even one of these, but you should never accuse Hamilton of not doing his homework. After providing exhaustive evidence, and I mean pages after pages, Hamilton concludes that power over a colony rested with the council that was established for that colony, not with the king or the Parliament. And this was true for all the colonies. Hamilton argues, in quote, it is true that New York has no charter, but if it could support its claim to liberty in no other way, it might, with justice, plead the common principles of colonization, for it would be unreasonable to seclude one colony from the enjoyment of the most important privileges of the rest. There is no need, however, of this plea, Hamilton says. The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power, end quote. It's a pretty powerful quote. As Hamilton notes, Congress acknowledges that Britain has the right to regulate trade. Hamilton is willing to concede that Britain can profit from that trade, but it should not get all the profits. The danger is that Parliament is abusing its authority. We are, Hamilton believes, best acquainted with our own circumstances and therefore best qualified to make suitable regulations. The laws of Parliament are useless since we are already connected with Britain through our loyalty to the king. The laws are often prejudicial and they may become tyrannical. The colonies already paid their dues in full in both men and money during the French and Indian War, Hamilton claims. If Parliament were not so greedy, we would be happy to esteem the welfare of Britain as the best security to our own. In 50 or 60 years, we will be strong enough to defend ourselves, and Britain will need us more than we need them. And there is a quote here, the claim of Parliament to bind us by statutes in all cases whatsoever is unconstitutional, unjust, and tyrannical. So this abuse started with the Stamp Act of 1765, but has continued until today, 1775. After the Boston Tea Party, Parliament imposed brutal punishment on Boston with the Intolerable Acts of 1774. In response, Hamilton argues, extraordinary emergencies require extraordinary expedients. The best mode of opposition was a union of councils. A Congress was accordingly proposed and universally agreed to. And another quote, when human laws contradict the means which are necessary to preserve the essential rights of any society, they defeat the proper end of all laws, and so become null and void, end quote. Therefore, the Continental Congress was not illegal. Regarding the economy, Hamilton calculates that it will take about 112 years for Britain to pay off its current national debt. British manufacturers are in a sorry state. Britain is overpopulated and is experiencing large-scale immigration to America. But thanks to its natural resources, America can survive quite well without Britain, on the other hand. Hamilton offers a detailed analysis of our present situation, as well as confident predictions for the future. He says we have few skilled workers in manufacturing, but we will make up for this deficit thanks to immigration. Our coastline is long and the British Navy cannot police it effectively, so goods from France and Holland can be imported.
Okay, so now what about war? So Hamilton says if war breaks out, even the disciplined British army would have a hard time subjugating us because we are fighting for our liberty. If Britain defeats us, she would be defeating herself by destroying her own very profitable colonies. But then on the other hand, why should we assume that Britain will win? She can spare only around 15,000 men, Hamilton calculates, while America could field a massive army of up to 600,000 men. So this is based on the idea that there are over 3 million American colonists, and then if 20% of them are adult men who are in fighting condition, then we have this number. So even a more conservative estimate of 500,000 would still give America a 30-to-1 advantage. And that may be too many to manage in the field. So we would need only 40,000 under arms at any one time. And in terms of tactics and strategy, Hamilton recommends avoiding one single decisive battle, but instead using guerrilla tactics and skirmishes to harass the enemy, for which our countryside is better suited. And also, he says, thanks to our abundant resources, it will be much easier for us to supply our troops than for Britain, which will have to import everything. And in terms of foreign aid, France, Spain, and Holland will be unable to resist the temptation to help us. So France and Spain were adversaries of England, but they promised to remain neutral. Holland was an ally of England, but they were always looking to make a profit, and they were sympathetic to our side. So these three countries have too much to gain, either by weakening a longtime adversary or by creating new markets for their goods. And then, so how accurate were these predictions? So Hamilton, of course, was overly optimistic about American troop strength. So, think about Washington's difficulty keeping an army in the field, and think about the number of loyalists who refused to join the American cause or were actively working against it. On the other hand, he was very accurate about tactics and strategy. So what he proposed is what actually ended up working best for the Americans. One thing that he didn't consider was how difficult it would be to get Americans to hand over supplies, and also the fact that the British might seize these supplies rather than importing everything. On the other hand, he was very accurate about the willingness of France and Spain and Holland to help out.
So nevertheless, Hamilton adds reassuringly, despite Seabury's ominous warnings, the colonies do not want war, and they do not claim an absolute independency. Congress has declared its loyalty to the king and is merely claiming the rights to which it is legally entitled. Now, Hamilton expresses his hopes for America. And I'm going to have a little longer quote, but it's wonderful. I earnestly lament the unnatural quarrel between the parent state and the colonies, and most ardently wish for a speedy reconciliation, a perpetual and mutually beneficial union. I'm a warm advocate for limited monarchy and an unfeigned well-wisher to the present royal family. But on the other hand, I am inviolably attached to the essential rights of mankind and the true interests of society. I consider civil liberty in a genuine, unadulterated sense as the greatest of terrestrial blessings. I'm convinced that the whole human race is entitled to it and that it can be wrested from no part of them without the blackest and most aggravated guilt. Hamilton believes that the best way to secure a permanent and happy union between Great Britain and the colonies is to permit the latter to be as free as they desire. He ends the essay by declaring that harmony and mutual confidence may speedily be restored between all the parts of the British Empire, is the favorite wish of one who feels the warmest sentiments of good will to mankind, who bears no enmity to you, and who is a sincere friend to America. That's the end of his Farmer Refuted.
Okay. So now let's just sum up some of the key principles. So Seabury agrees that American colonists have individual rights, but that these are best protected under the king and the parliament. He believes that the Continental Congress was illegally elected, illegally convened, and it risks bringing the colonies into civil war and destruction. And the proper way to proceed is to petition the New York General Assembly for which was lawfully instituted for any redress of grievances.
And Hamilton argued that American colonists have been unlawfully oppressed by the British Parliament, which has no jurisdiction over the colonies and therefore has no right to impose laws and taxes. Because petitions from the General Assembly have been ineffective, the people of the colonies lawfully elected delegates to the Continental Congress, which enacted forceful yet appropriate measures to effect change. We hope that Britain will finally restore our liberties, but if it does not, we are ready to fight for them.
Okay, so what happened to these gentlemen afterwards? Seabury wrote to Rivington that he would prepare a response to the Farmer Refuted, but we don't have any evidence that he ever carried that out. So either he didn't write it or he wrote it and it wasn't published. And one theory for that was that, you know, matters got pretty heated pretty quickly after that, because by April, there was also already open rebellion with the battles of Lexington and Concord. In the meantime, Seabury had signed something called the Protest of Inhabitants and Freeholders of Westchester County, New York, against all unlawful congresses and committees. And he was arrested actually in November of '75 by Connecticut patriots under Captain Isaac Sears, and they were on their way to loot the printing office of James Rivington for the second time. And Seabury was imprisoned in New Haven for 6 weeks, and then later on he was released. He was appointed chaplain of the King's American Regiment in New York City in 1778. And in contrast to many loyalists, Seabury stayed in America, moving to Connecticut after the war. And he became the first American Episcopal bishop. So this was when the Episcopal Church established itself separately from the Church of England. So in order to do this, there was no Episcopal bishop in America to consecrate him. So he traveled to London, but in London, it turns out he would have to take an oath of loyalty to the king, but he couldn't do that. So he had to travel to Aberdeen in Scotland to be consecrated, where there was a church that wouldn't require him to take an oath of loyalty to the king.
And now, just to sum up Hamilton's major accomplishments of his life, his military career, he, of course, was aide-de-camp to George Washington. He became a hero of Yorktown, and he came to be a major general and inspector general of the U.S. Army later in the century. He was a charter member of the New York Manumission Society, a founder of the Bank of New York. He became a delegate to the Annapolis Convention, the Constitutional Convention, the New York Ratifying Convention. He was the father of the Federalist Papers, writing 51 of the 85 essays offered in it. And as first US Treasury Secretary between 1789 and 1795, he created the financial and economic system of the US and saved the country from financial ruin after the Revolution.
And he defended loyalists after the Revolutionary War.
He did.
Yeah.
That's an aspect of his career that it's not often emphasized, but it's extremely important.
Okay,
So
I think that's what we have.
yes,
So,
that's our presentation. It took us days and days and days to go through these very lengthy essays and sift through the various arguments. But I would say that for me, that was incredibly enlightening to read the words of our founders and to see both positions, both loyalists and those who supported Congress, and understand what was behind it, behind their positions. And there is so much on both sides that is valuable, and it's worth noting and worth hearing in their own words. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm sure we're having everyone a warm round of applause for Tom and Mariana for their wonderful presentation. It's just so wonderful to always constantly have new topics to explore. Of course, one of the reasons we study Hamilton is that he's so multifaceted and there's so much there. But I think that not only was this a great dive into his early writings, but so timely to celebrate the 250th anniversary of their writing. So thank you for all the efforts and work that you put in and your scholarship that you put into this. I just think it's wonderful. We'd love to kick it off with some questions. We have had some come in through the chat, and we welcome you, if you haven't yet, to add some more. One of the questions here, Reggie A., thank you so much for the presentation. How did Spain and Holland support the revolution? I was unaware of this. Are you able to speak to that a little bit?
yeah, so Spain was allied with France. France obviously was helping the US secretly after the revolution broke out, and then openly after the Battle of Saratoga and the Treaty of Alliance. And Spain was sort of supplying materiel. They weren't sending much in the way of actual military support, like in the form of troops and ships, but I believe they were supporting, by providing supplies. And Holland was doing the same. So the island of St. Eustatius in the Caribbean was this main point. And Seabury actually mentions this, that there's Seabury, right? That there was an island in the Caribbean that he didn't name, but it was St. Eustatius, and they were funneling supplies to America throughout the Revolution, and England made them pay for this very brutally after the Revolutionary War was over.
Thank you. We also had a question, how is the pseudonym connected to Seabury, the A.W. Farmer? Did he claim, and separately from that, did he claim authorship of that pamphlet at any later point in his life?
Yes, he did. So he, on several occasions, claimed that he was the author. So that's not, as far as I know, it's not really contested. And he calls himself a farmer, I think, so that he can, first of all, preserve his anonymity, and second, make a sort of case as if he were one of the ordinary people rather than somebody in this elevated position of being a minister.
Was it mentioned
Thank you.
Michael Newton, I think?
Oh, what, say that?
Yeah, I think that was also mentioned probably by Michael.
Oh, that the authorship?
Yeah,
So Michael E. Newton, a great historian who wrote Alexander Hamilton, the formative years. He has more or less proved that it was Seabury that was the author.
Thank you. We have a question from our good friend Nancy Spanis. Terrific presentation, Marianne and Tom. Okay if I reference my coverage of the speeches?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, for the same reason as you on the 250th, I was requested to do an event last June at the Fort Plain Museum on these pamphlets. And it's written up on my blog, and it has no contradictory material to, it's, really the same orientation, but mine, given the way I've dealt with Hamilton on manufacturers, really plays up the manufacturing question, because it's extraordinary that he is saying we can exist independent of Britain. We have the resources. They're jealous of us, actually, because we have all these resources and we're going to be rich and we're going to be a republic. I mean, that great quote that you have, there's another quote in there about being a republic would be the most horrible thing, but which is the one I used, but you used that one. It's absolutely terrific. So people can get that. I took a quote from the first pamphlet, Full Vindication, which said it was for the grandeur and glory of America. So if you put into americansystemnow.com, I'll put it in the chat, for the grandeur and glory of America, you'll get, a written version of my view of the same material, which I think you'll find useful and complimentary.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yes, thank you. Please do include the link so we can all enjoy. Thank you so much. We have a follow-up on the question about the pseudonym. Did Hamilton know that A.W. Farmer was Seabury's pen name? And conversely, did Seabury know that Friend to America was Hamilton at the time? Is there any evidence that explains a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so initially, no, but pretty quickly, word got out. So Hamilton's friends, Hercules Mulligan and Robert Troup, both reported that Hamilton was writing parts of his pamphlets while he was visiting with them, and he would read to them out loud. So gradually, or not gradually, pretty quickly, he became known as the author of A Friend to America. And actually, the loyalists thought he was so formidable that they tried to recruit him. And I think I'm not
And
quite.
he refused.
And he refused, of course.
That is actually that Michael Newton discusses that episode. So if anyone is interested in looking at the format, Alexander Hamilton, the formative years, there is even more information there about it.
Wow.
Perfect, thank you. Can you both comment on the idea that most of the world governments at that time were technically not free, and how that discourse was used at the time?
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting to note how revolutionary this was and the fact that it was able to succeed. So interestingly, most of Europe was run by absolute monarchs, and Great Britain was one of the most progressive ones around. So there were, of course, more republican forms of government in what's now Switzerland. But democracy, or a republican form of government rather, was something that was pretty unusual. So we do have, a republican form of government up to a certain extent in Holland at the time as well.
Wonderful. And are there records of how many copies of these writings were printed to get an idea of how many people would have actually read these at the time?
I would say that the print run, I mean, we do not have exact records on pamphlets like that, but it would easily be in the upper hundreds or over 1,000 for something ephemeral of that sort that can be spread around quickly, folded, bound very simply. There is no need to put a lot of expense into it. And we know that these pamphlets had reached beyond New York for certain. They had been carried out to different parts of the colonies. So others who are interested in the developments of the time would get to read it. Yeah, so I would say easily over 1,000.
And I would imagine too, with the tavern culture at the time, that even though there might be one copy that reached the town, it would be read aloud and everyone would dissect it as a community oftentimes.
Did you mention Washington?
Yes, and especially, no, not yet, but especially due to the fact that the topic was so hot at the time, it was such a big discussion. Congress was proceeding, and the pamphlets came as a result, and they were stirring, in both directions. One was presented by a loyalist, the other one by someone supporting Congress. So everybody wanted to hear both sides and to get their hands on the pamphlets. Yes, Michael Newton discussed in his book that perhaps even George Washington may have gotten a copy of those pamphlets because there was someone in New York who was sending him regularly everything that's being published from the Rivington Press down to Mount Vernon, and even on occasion would visit Washington with a whole bunch of new publications. So most likely Washington had gotten his hands on those pamphlets and read them, although it's not certain that Washington knew at the time who the authors were.
Right. And Henry Knox up in Boston, before he became general of artillery, he was a bookseller, and he had the pamphlets in his bookstore.
Wonderful. We also have a question here from Faye Boatwright. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. How do you believe Seabury squared his religious studies and beliefs with his view of man as barbaric, not sure of the exact word used in your presentation, and thus needing protection, implied paternalistic, cannot stand its own of the British crown?
Right. So I think that probably what's going on there is, um, I wouldn't say that Seabury believes in this idea that there was this state of nature as described by philosophers like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, but more that the general nature of mankind is kind of perverse and kind of um, subject to temptations and subject to being evil and violent. And this is, I guess you could say, is um, following after the original sin, so the fall of mankind from the Garden of Eden. Then it would be relatively easy to see how it would Seabury could believe that mankind would need the kind of strong government that he's promoting.
Mm-hmm. And was Seabury ever arrested or captured by the Patriots?
Yeah, so again, in like November of 1775, he was in New York, and there was a mob of patriots, and they were heading off to trash Rivington's press. And again, this had happened in May of 75. Now it's happening again in November. And along the way, they seized Seabury. They brought him to Connecticut, to New Haven. Yeah, and he was paraded up and down the street, and then he was imprisoned, and then he stayed there for 6 weeks. And he refused to either confirm or deny at that time that he was the author of the pamphlets. So they had to let him go. And again, after they let him go, he went to New York and served as chaplain to the King's Rangers. And then after the war, again, he stayed in America rather than going into exile as so many other loyalists did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And was the Seabury's relationship with the new government after the revolution? Do we know anything about that?
Ooh, good question. I do not.
I mean, he was going to England later on, and
yeah, well, he's described as a loyal citizen of America. So once the war was over, once the cause was lost, he decided to remain and tend to his flock. And he did, do that. So, and he had to go all the way to England and Scotland in order to be consecrated a bishop. And then he came back and served faithfully for the rest of his life. And he's a really important figure in the Episcopal Church because of that. Again, he was the first bishop, the second presiding bishop of this new church that was founded after the separation from the Anglican Church.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. As a follow-up, Teresa McNally says breaking presses was the original cancel culture.
Yeah.
And then we have a follow-up question to Faye's question. Do you think that Seabury, as a clergyman, was sincerely devoted to pacifism and welfare of all humanity, or was it all his talk to justify the British Empire? Just from what you've personally read.
Well, from what I read, I have the feeling that he indeed wanted to preserve law and order, and he believed that that would be the British law and order that is being established and being maintained. I believe that from what I read, that he indeed was not eager to see a civil war. He was very much against that. He was seeing the dangers of kind of radical ideas and changing the status quo. So I would say that he's more of a pacifist than someone who desires to engage in more violent resolutions of conflict.
No, I wouldn't say he's looking for that, but on the other hand, like the head of the king is the ruler of the empire, but he's also the head of the Church of England. And Seabury was very loyal to both the empire and to the crown and to the church. So, whatever they decide, then he's going to go along with that. And he's really upset
True.
by these by disobedience. And of course, he was I guess back in those days they had more fire and brimstone sermons. So you can see some of that fire and brimstone in his criticism of what the colonists are doing. But just on the other side, Hamilton was always against mob rule. So if you recall, it was he that harangued the crowd in front of the house of Miles Cooper, the president of King's College, who was a loyalist, so that Cooper could have a chance to escape. Hamilton criticized the destruction of Rivington's printing press, and he also he understood why the Boston colonists were doing it, but he didn't like the violence and destruction of property during the Tea Party.
Wonderful. I was going to comment, it is so fascinating how on the face of things, both of them are in favor of the same things, preservation of the rule of law, preservation of order. We have a comment here. Seabury's consecration by the non-juring Scottish bishops sparked concern within the British government. They feared it might lead to the establishment of a fully Jacobite church in the United States. This alarm prompted Parliament to act, ultimately allowing for the ordination of foreign bishops. Seabury's determination played a pivotal role in preserving the connection between the American and English churches.
Yep, absolutely correct.
We do have a question here from Corey. In history, writing propaganda going against the government, one could be thrown in jail now. And nowadays, was it like that back during this time? Would Hamilton have been scared of his work being published and potentially being jailed? Or...
Can I interrupt? Like with communism, like for example, that's right. I forgot to mention that. Like, you can't write anything bad about the government in a communist country, and so they would throw you into jail. Was it like that in his time? Like, if he wrote, like especially with that pamphlet, would Hamilton been scared? Like, oh my goodness, I'm putting my neck out there, and if somebody, the wrong person picks it up, I could be thrown in jail because I'm criticizing Parliament and how they are doing their stuff. Or was it what did he feel safe? Go, okay, a lot of the colonists are feeling this way, so I'm pretty protected. That's what I would like to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there were there were colonists who were arrested for, breaking the rules. And I think this level, I don't know, what would you say, Nicole, about, the level of risk that Hamilton was taking on? Because on the one hand, he's he's pledging loyalty to the crown, but on the other hand, he's saying we have the complete right to disregard the measures of Congress. But he's trying to do it in a careful way, and he's trying to justify everything according to the charters of the different colonies, which were agreed to by the crown. So it seems like he wasn't doing anything that was riotous. He was, considering what might happen if things got to the point of an open rebellion and how we should act. But he wasn't advocating for that, at least not at this point.
Yeah, that's a really good question and thought. I don't haven't studied this area too deeply to really be able to cite what has happened to others at that time. To the best of my knowledge, the use of pseudonyms was de rigueur just from a social sense, but that oftentimes people would know who wrote the pamphlet. So I don't think it was necessarily for protection. I'm not aware of laws where someone could be jailed by that time, but again, it's not my area of expertise to say for sure. But I think more so, I've heard of plenty printing presses being attacked, but not the individuals for writing being attacked at this time period.
Hmm.
Yeah. One question I had, and I was curious if either of you had come across this in your research, is obviously because Hamilton has become famous later in his life and then has throughout the centuries, we know his works. Have you delved much into the other discourse at this time, the other published pamphlets, to have a good sense of, were these really the top tier pamphlets that were being discussed? I mean, obviously we know Common Sense and others were quite big, but where on the scale of popular publications from what you've looked into could you say that these documents fell in?
Yeah, well, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, that came out just a couple of months before the Declaration of Independence, and that when it came out was an absolute bestseller for the time, and it was read all up and down, and it came out in multiple editions. And Paine didn't even bother trying to reserve the rights for himself, so he just wanted it to be able to be republished and republished as much as possible. And these letters, the pamphlet war between Seabury and Hamilton are at a pretty high level for 1774 and early 75. And it's interesting that there were a number of patriots who wrote pamphlets criticizing Seabury, but Hamilton was the only one that he bothered to reply to. So
Mm.
even as he mocks him, he has to acknowledge that Hamilton is, or a friend to America is the most formidable opposition that he's faced so far. And then Hamilton, it seems, these are the pamphlets that we know about that he wrote. And, Seabury was the one that he thought was most worthy of being responded to and the most dangerous for the cause. So I think patriots were pretty worried at first when Seabury came out with his pamphlets, but then they were reassured greatly by Hamilton's response. And there were other pamphlets that had some people try to attribute to Hamilton, like what Anglus Americanus and a few others, but those haven't been proved to be by him. And Hamilton did promise to write several other essays, and he wrote one. The only one that we know of from this time is on Quebec, the Quebec question.
Well,
But
Wonderful.
didn't
And
that,
that is such an important point that you mentioned that, that was the only one that uh, a farmer deemed worthy of responding to. I think that in itself highlights how important Hamilton's pamphlet was. And also, we can't forget how young he was at the time. So many thought, oh, there's no way it could be, a college student. It's just so full of so mature in its thought, and so it was a while until people really believed. They thought it was maybe John Jay or a more established statesman that had
Livingston.
written.
There was evidence that Hamilton, the loyalists tried to recruit Hamilton to write for their cause, but he refused.
I think, didn't John Adams write one of his major pieces almost about this same time, in February of 1775?
Right.
But of course, it wasn't a polemical pamphlet in the way that Hamilton is a polemical pamphlet, although Hamilton doesn't mention any names to my knowledge. So that's where you would get in trouble, as I believe it, if with libel, right? So
Yes.
if you don't go, if you deal with it in more of the abstract or the position, then you sort
And
of
not personal attacks.
yeah,
That's a very
you
important point.
evade the potential for being thrown in jail for libel, which I think you still could be.
Which is again fascinating, because Hamilton later on established a precedent that truth was a defense for libel, because before, if you said something negative and you published it, even if it was accurate, you could still be jailed. So thank you. That's a really good point about if libel is incorporated, that someone could get into trouble for that.
Well, we know that
Yes.
Rivington was publishing pamphlets on both sides, of course. And Hamilton was a protector of the freedom of the press. So that's why he was so outraged when they attacked the press and destroyed the types. So Hamilton wrote, I believe, to John Jay about that matter, to lament the situation and try to interfere even for the benefit of Rivington. So it looks like, publishers would always seek to publish something that would be sold. So Rivington would be publishing every kind of pamphlet that people might have interest in reading, no matter on what side it is. And the freedom of the press is so important, well, back then and today, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a comment here referring to Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, that it was pivotal in the independence movements of South America, and it really inspired a lot of the discourse down there against the Spanish crown. So recommending to look it up. And so amazing. And also just want to give a congratulations to our friend Linda Graubert. She's joining the Coast Guard Auxiliary here to keep up the Hamilton tradition. So we look forward to hearing more, and
Wonderful.
how amazing. We love continuing to partner with the Coast Guard, and can't wait to hear more about your service. So with that, we've had a very robust Q&A session. We thank you all for staying and being so involved and bringing beautiful questions to the table. We always love when our attendees come with so many wonderful questions. I want everyone to, again, we've seen in the comments how wonderful this was, but please join me in giving Tom and Mariana a warm round of applause for their wonderful presentation today. We thank you so much for being here with us, and we do hope that you'll stay connected with us. I'm sure many of you already are, but if you are not, please join our mailing list, follow us on Facebook, our social media, and this is the beginning of a new calendar year, 2025. So if you visit the ahasociety.org, we hope that you will click on Become a Member and join us today. Or if you'd like to throw a Hamilton our way in thanks for this free presentation for Happy Birthday Hamilton, you can also support us here, and we would really greatly appreciate any contributions to help support our programming. I do hope that you will join us back on February 12th. The information will be going out soon to our mailing list and Facebook. So again, please connect with us there. And we can't wait to our next presentation. Happy birthday, Hamilton. Post with us what you end up doing to celebrate his birthday today. And thank you again, all. Thank you, Tom and Mariana, and wishing you all a wonderful evening. Take care.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you.
everybody.